Stewart, and I am pleased to have a man who was at my alma mater, Dartmouth. His first year was my last, but he's now been there for over 30 years. The esteemed Richard Wright, geography professor at Dartmouth College. Professor, welcome.
Oh, thank you very much.
So, Professor, what do you see as the nation's biggest needs now regarding immigration?
Without a doubt, in my opinion, the biggest need is for a complete review of current immigration legislation and comprehensive immigration reform taking place as soon as possible. And I don't think that there's many people in Congress who would disagree with that opinion. I think there are, one of the interesting things about immigration is it often doesn't, sometimes, but often doesn't cut down party lines in ways that some other issues do. On this issue, you can find elements that are very partisan, but I think there would be broad agreement that we should have a debate about immigration. The last time we passed comprehensive immigration legislation was in 1990. And so that's 29 years ago. If you look back to the first pieces of legislation, or you look back through the whole 20th century, there hasn't been a period where the country has waited for so long to reform the means by which people can immigrate to the United States.
And I don't remember a debate in 1990. Was this very cloistered with just the Bush administration and a few bureaucrats, or was there a very popular referendum going on?
Oh, there's no referendum. But the last immigration act was the Immigration Act of 1990. And it changed a few things from the really revolutionary 1965 Act, expanding the opportunities for people to immigrate to the United States. And it was one of those pieces of legislation that I don't think had a very, very high profile. In contrast, the Immigration Acts of the 1920s and the Immigration Act of 1965 was very much a moment of a kind of a statement in which the United States made certain claims as to who they wanted to immigrate here.
Now, why don't you tell us? I think I know what 1920s was restrictive and 1965 was quite permissive. Can you elaborate?
Sure. 1920s, there's two Quota Acts. They're known as the Quota Acts of 1921 and 1924. And their main function was to reduce immigration to the United States. There had been a period of mass migration. So one of the goals was to reduce the numbers. A second goal, which I think many would agree was much more pernicious, in that it targeted for reduction specific groups from specific countries. And there were concerns about the immigrants coming from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. And those concerns aren't the same concerns that we might have today. These were concerns based in eugenicist theory. So the thinking was that migrants from Southern Europe were somehow less worthy of membership, not the kind of citizen that we would want among us, and in some ways fundamentally unassimilable. That especially applied to people coming from Asia and especially China. So 21 had this, was sort of notorious for reducing immigration and then targeting who came. And it was very effective in doing that. It had some other features that are interesting that tend to fly beneath the radar. And where was I? 1921 had these effects: reducing immigration significantly, reducing immigration from specific countries, and it was highly, highly effective in doing so. The other things that the 21 and 24 Acts did, though, was establish mechanisms by which people come here. And those mechanisms, first and foremost, were through the family. So every piece of legislation in that the United States has passed has family migration as its at its heart, actually, as the cornerstone of how you become a legal permanent resident and then move on to citizenship. The 21 and 24 Acts also had provisions for employment. And again, these have been present in every piece of legislation through the 20th century. And if we were going to project through to the future, we would anticipate that the debate will be about the ratio of people coming through family means and the ratio of people coming through employment means.
So in the 20s,
65 was very different.
Like there weren't...
65 actually turned over those Quota Acts of 1921 and 24 and established a completely different... there were country caps established that were equal across all countries. Family, again, was privileged, and the immediate family members could enter without numerical limit, just as they had in the 1920s, by the way. So we have a situation where the 21 and 24 Acts that was very discriminatory against certain groups no longer were, and yet we still have these means by which you enter family and employment, and especially family in 1965, given actually greater billing in the Act. And 1990...
So before we get to the 1990, that 1920s legislation, it didn't sound like Americans were afraid of an enormous number of Brits, French, Dutch, Germans coming over, were they?
No, they weren't. They were very concerned about Jews and Catholics, and so the nativism of the time had a religious form. There was also concern that people coming from Central and Eastern Europe, especially, were not only Jewish and unlikely to assimilate into some sort of Protestant mainstream, they were also radicals. And there was a great concern about radicals entering the country. And there was a distinct eugenicist preference for people from Northern and Western Europe.
So tell us about 65 now.
So 65 ostensibly established a level playing field. Every country has a similar cap. So in some ways, they're not called quotas, but they're called caps. Family, immediate family can enter without numerical limit. And 65 also did away with, and few people know this, but it did away with an exception for people migrating here from the Western Hemisphere. Before 1965, throughout the 20th century, throughout the 19th century, people from the Western Hemisphere were a separate category. So 65 actually put caps on every country: Mexico, the Soviet Union, Switzerland, all had similar caps. And you notice that I chose those countries because they were very different sizes. So one of the level playing fields that the 65 Act was established was, it was much more difficult. Those caps are going to be hit by larger countries. But the way to think about 65, I think, is to embed it in the civil rights legislation that was taking place domestically, providing new opportunities and legislation that was providing a much more democratic society within the country, especially for African Americans. So the Immigration Act of 65, we should see as part and parcel of that impulse to democratize immigration in ways that were far less discriminatory than they had been for the previous 40 years.
So now tell us about the 1990 legislation in contrast.
So 1990 expanded the means by which families could rejoin their relatives in the United States or join them. The 1990 Act also provided, instead of one or two employment categories, there were now 5 employment-based preference categories. So the 1990 Act began to reorganize that ratio, or certainly the emphasis on family versus employment, and began to open up the opportunities for people coming here through employment.
Is those categories, is that where we're getting the H-1B versus the less skilled and no?
No. H-1B is a separate program, and the 1990 Act also established the H-1B. So that's a separate immigrant visa category. Now, that is not one of these employment preferences. There are 5 employment preferences, and H-1B is separate. H-1B actually is an immigrant visa. You can become a legal permanent resident, a green card holder from an H-1B holder, but it's not one of those employment preferences that the United States established. So there were 5 family-based preferences and 5 employment-based preferences. And then H-1Bs was another part of that effort to increase the opportunity for certain types of workers to at least work temporarily in the United States. The H-1B is an interesting visa, though, and I'm glad you brought it up. It's a dual intent visa, meaning that your intent could be to visit as an immigrant temporarily for a year or a few months or a few years. But it also provides the opportunity for individuals to apply for permanent residence while being here temporarily. There are very few visa categories that have that kind of duality. H-1B is one of them, and the other one that I'm familiar with is the L one, which is an intercompany transfer. So you can see the arguments here in 1990: increasing emphasis on employment, maintaining family preferences, and there were a few other aspects to the 1990 Act too that are notable. In that, the Congress, in its wisdom, decided that the flow of migrants to the United States was not as diverse as they perhaps thought it should be, and introduced what has become known as the diversity lottery visa. About 50,000 places that people can enter a lottery for from most places in the world, but those places that are most underrepresented are more likely to succeed in winning the lottery. So you can see we have the maintenance and even expansion of family-based preferences, the employment-based preferences having a greater stake now than ever before. The H-1B visa, which we know is debated, and we can talk about that maybe in some more detail, but it's controversial. And then even perhaps more controversially, this diversity lottery. So here we are in 2019, and like I say, I think there are several issues to do with each of these categories that we can agree across the political spectrum that are worth debating.
So before any legislation could take place, because you say we need it and we need it soon, don't we really need to be answering the question of who do we want to come in and who do we want to keep out?
That's absolutely right. Yes, I think those sorts of basic questions might frame the debate. So, do we want immediate relatives of family to be given high preference? Do we want millionaire investor visas to come here, like many other countries have similar kinds of visas? Is that something that we value? Do we value what work has the diversity lottery done? I think I'd love to see a study of that. I've never seen an academic or policy-oriented study of the diversity lottery. The current thinking, though, is that several things are broken, and you can paint this in broad brush strokes and then get to some specific details. So I'll give you 2 or 3 very broad brush strokes. The diversity lottery, I think, has lost support. The ratio of family to employment, I think there certainly seems to be a current that that is drawing people into the idea that these need to be more in balance. Right now,
are you saying the imbalance now is there's
is too
not
great.
enough jobs for the number of people who want to come here?
I think personally, I think there are.
Yes, in New Hampshire we have a labor shortage.
Yeah, and I think many and if you look at the literature on employment, immigrants have higher participation rates. The economic impacts of immigrants over the short and particularly the long term are either negligible or very positive for the United States. So, I mean, the evidence for employment, I think, is pretty strong. Right now, though, the emphasis is, do we reduce the number of family-based entrants? Because some of these categories include quite, brothers and sisters, parents. The current administration, for example, would like to get rid of a preference for, in fact, not even a preference, but above and beyond the quota-free entry for parents. So about 100,000 people a year enter sponsored by their children, and they enter without numerical restriction. And the current administration has targeted that They think that's not a good idea.
We are speaking with Dartmouth Professor Richard Wright about many facets of immigration. I am Mark Stewart. Thanks for joining us. Professor, if today we could enforce the laws that are on the books and at the same time all quotas were filled, would we be increasing the number of immigrants or decreasing the number of immigrants?
I think neither is the answer. I think the rate would pretty much stay the same. Repeat the question for me.
Thinking about the net increase or decrease that would come if laws were actually enforced, that we really did turn back the people who were supposed to be turned back, yet immigrants came in the fullest capacity that we do allow within, that all quotas are filled. Would that put us having more immigrants each year, less immigrants each year, or about the same?
Yeah, it would stay the same. I'm pretty sure in that answer. You talk about laws being sort of applied to their fullest extent. We are doing that, and perhaps we're overzealously guarding the border, in my opinion. So right now, we have a net zero or net negative migration with Mexico. In other words, including all sorts of statuses, if we include the whole range of status, there is a net negative migration with Mexico. And this has been going on for about 10 years. So, I mean, when people talk about enforcing the laws, I think we should think about that very carefully. There are all sorts of laws on the books. There are penalties for employers. There are penalties penalties for employers of both the foreign-born and the native-born and the unauthorized. I mean, so if we're going to enforce the laws on the books, I think I'm all for that. But let's do this with the full intent that we mean behind that statement, because it's a politically loaded statement. Often, foreign-born workers, again, whether they're here with authorization or without, are exploited in various ways. They are discriminated against in various ways. And we have laws that prevent such. So whenever somebody says we need to sort of apply the law to the fullest extent, okay, but let's really think through what that means.
So I did have a fairly searing, well, maybe it's not searing yet. Tell us about the Bracero program, because conservatives who seem to want to clamp down on the number of new citizens, they talk about Bracero as being a successful way of integrating immigrants but not making them citizens. Can you fill us in?
Sure. The Bracera program started in 1942 and it ended in 1964. It was a program that brought primarily Mexican male laborers to the United States to ostensibly fill labor shortages, primarily in agricultural production. And so you can see why perhaps it started in 1942. After the United States entered World War II, many men were drafted, joined, and were fighting in the Pacific arena or supporting and beginning to participate in the European theater. And labor shortages occurred in particular areas, notably agriculture. And so the Bracera program began. And it didn't end with the end of World War II. The farm lobby wanted to, it was successful in that it brought workers temporarily from Mexico. And it was sustained through the 1950s and then came under increasing scrutiny in the 1960s. So if the listeners, some of the listeners might be able to think back to this, there was a very famous documentary called Harvest of Shame, where dreadful employment conditions were exposed in I think it was a landmark documentary on American TV in the agricultural areas. Mexicans were being exploited, not being paid their wages. Cesar Chavez was unionizing the workforce, and so there was an increasing sympathy for a unionized agricultural workforce. So, and then there was questions about mechanization, which still resonate today. So three forces came together to work together to end it: public opinion, unionization, and then farm employers increasingly investing in capital as opposed to labor. And those three forces together, probably the three main forces that began to erode support for this, both in parts of the farm lobby and in the general public.
Now, Mexican who came here under the Bracero program, they didn't expect to gain citizenship, did they?
No, they did not. There was no expectation of that. It was a special category of worker, and it was a temporary worker, not dual intent, single intent, and the single intent was to come here, earn wages, and return. And remember, it plays into a historical flow of migrant workers toing and froing from Mexico to the United States and back again. This is something historically that has been going on for decades. And so the Bracera program in some ways formalized what had been an informal flow.
And don't we still have that now? My first job out of Dartmouth, I went to Vail to ski. So I was a ski bum by day, worked in restaurants by night. And I was loading dishes alongside guys from Mexico. And they made a lot of money. And then they went home in the summer to their families and lived relatively like kings because of the wage differential. I think we still have that now.
I would say no, and I'll say no for a couple of reasons. Because over the last 20 years, we have fortified the southern border. So what was a temporary, well, certainly parts of it were a temporary annual flow or biannual flow across the border to and fro, has turned now much more into a permanent migration because of the risks of crossing without entering without inspection in formal terms. Those are it's a very risky proposition. That has had a second effect, that while it used to be men coming back and forth, mostly men, not always, but predominantly men, because of the border fortification and because it is much more difficult to cross, whole families now are entering. And so the idea of toing and froing is far more difficult as a family unit as opposed to an individual, especially if you're single. Well, I'll leave it there.
All right. I promised the incendiary question.
Yeah.
Can you respond to what I think animates conservatives in America the most? That unbridled immigration brings not just the people, which they may not object to, but a new culture that many immigrants want to impose on the rest of Americans.
Yeah. I don't think, I think I think that's a terrible idea. And I think there's a lot of historical evidence to suggest quite the opposite, that the United States imposes itself on the immigrants. But I won't go that far. I'll go to some sort of middle ground, because I think the way to think about cultural change, cultural assimilation, or cultural integration is to see it as a two-way street. That the United States influences the immigrants, and the immigrants influence the United States. Culture is never static. I think one of the mistakes of a question like that is to presume that culture is static. First of all, it is absolutely not. Think about how language changes. Think about how clothing, or any aspect of culture, it changes. There are all sorts of influences on that. So the way to think about immigration, and I'll call it assimilation, the way to think about this is to think about people who are already here, people who are newcomers, coming together on a common ground. And there's a long history of this type of intermingling and assimilation taking place. I mean, there's lots and lots of examples of this historically. That would be my take on your question.
We're finishing up with Professor Richard Wright. I am Mark Stewart. I'm sometimes called Mr. Why. I like to know why. And I'll finish with this. Maybe you could tell us what currently are the most acute injustices, not just one, but if it's happening to many people, can you vivify for us where and when that's happening?
So I'll give you several ways to think about this. For me, I think the imprisonment of children is an acute injustice. So child detention should not be taking place on our southern border. We are detaining family units, we are detaining children, and I think that is a gross injustice, an acute injustice. I think more generally, the way that we are responding to claims of asylum by people who are arriving on our southern border are not being handled in the ways that we should be. We need more immigrant judges. We need more training for ICE and Border Patrol. We need the whole asylum claim process needs to be altered. We have people doing jobs that they weren't trained to do. So I think that is an acute problem that we need to address. A more difficult and equally, I think, maybe not equally, but certainly an acute problem are the wait times for people who are trying to enter through family-based categories. So we've been talking about that for a fair amount of time, but I never got into the backlogs that are associated with each of these kinds of family-based preferences. Some of them have wait times of 20 years. So if you're thinking of an acute problem, you think of acute as something that could be immediately fixed and is an acute pain, needs some medication. But this is a long, dreadfully long wait time that we need to address for certain categories of migrant who have to wait 10, 15, 20 years for their number to come up.
Some people would counter your first depiction, the families, the children being separated, by saying, look, it's the family adults who are deciding to come, whether it's under an attempt for asylum or an attempt for a true visa program. They know the rules. They're the ones bringing the kids and putting them in jeopardy of the rules as they stand now. And it seems like there'd be a solution that says, if you are granted in husband and wife, then 3 months later, bring the kids on. In the meantime, they'll stay with Aunt Matilda, they'll stay with grandma, and still stay in their home.
So what's the question?
Is it really a U.S. policy problem that is making families split at the border, kids from adults?
Yeah.
Or is it really the migrants who are attempting to circumvent what they should know is a policy that's going to separate them.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe then we look at other countries. What do other countries do? And, you know, maybe there aren't that many models that we would like to emulate. But there are some perhaps where we could think about.
Tell us some.
Well, okay. So Angela Merkel, to her incredible credit and to her incredibly high political cost, let in, admitted 1 million people who were fleeing the terrors of Syria. A lot of these were family units. 1 million people were let in, and she said, we are going to process them, and some who pass screening will stay, and those that don't pass screening will be returned. She paid the highest political cost a politician can. She's going to step down as chancellor. It was an incredibly, I'm using the word incredible, it was a deeply unpopular decision on her part, and yet I think it was the right decision to make. We have a history of being able to do this. We did it in the 1980s with Vietnamese. 1 million Vietnamese came in that decade, or Southeast Asians, I should say, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. About 1 million people arrived in that decade as refugees. We were able to handle it. We set up special camps. We set up special instruments to do this, like on Guam, and people were processed there.
And then they could come over as a family.
We've done it before. We can deal with this. But to throw up your arms and say it's an invasion or say they're criminals, I think that's naive at best and pernicious at worst.
You've been very illuminating. Thanks for both the history and the present and somewhat looking to the future.
Okay.
Richard Wright, I wish you a great holiday. I thank you again and hope to have you back.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Take care.
All right. Can I?
Let me do a stop.
Okay.
Let me do a stop. Okay.
I was going to tell you about Japan. Look, I don't study comparative asylum law, but Japan lets in, like 2 years ago, let in 7 refugees.
That's why I didn't, with my question, I said, tell me about the third world countries. And I knew that Japan was just terrible on that.
I mean, that's just appalling.
How about those other 4? Israel, Hong Kong,
yeah,
Singapore.
I don't.
Are they decent places?
Again, it depends on your claim. So Israel lets in anyone who's Jewish. So if you've got, you know, it depends on your claim. If you're fleeing persecution and you're a Jew, they're going to take you.
Right. All right. So say it's an Arab Syrian.
Yeah, I don't know. I just don't know. I don't know the answer to that question.
And how about any of those others? Hong Kong, Singapore?
I don't think anyone's going to Hong Kong at the moment. I think the flow is reversing. And so I just don't know about Singapore.
Okay.
No. I mean, I think the other thing to think about with refugees is that a lot of them just move either internally or they move to neighboring countries and await, maybe sometimes for years and sometimes for decades, and wait for the situation to rectify itself. So that's, you know, so Turkey, for all the problems that government has and is, Turkey has this significant refugee population from Syria. And remember, Erdogan has used this as a political weapon, saying, I'll close the camps if you don't do X, Y, and Z. And that's a very powerful political tool he has at his disposal.
So is this a possible solution on the asylum front? That asylum be liberalized? You fear persecution. We're not even going to get into how bad or how good it is. But we're not going to give you citizenship. We're going to give you a 7-year stay, and maybe you'll go back home because things will be better by that.
Yeah, that's a possibility.
But right now, it doesn't sound like it is. It sounds like asylum is a citizen or not situation.
It's a green light, red light. It's binary. You get through the interview, and the interview ends, and somebody makes a decision. even if you, so there's various stages, but there's several interviews. The first thing that takes place is a credible fear interview. And you really need to know, I mean, you talked about these people knowing the law, but they have no clue about how tricky the credible fear interview can be. And if you don't say the right thing there, even if you have a completely legitimate claim, if you use the wrong language, it's done.
So how is this for a possible policy? Don't even make a distinction between asylum and wanting to immigrate for economic reasons. For whatever reason, if you're not a criminal, you don't seem dangerous, don't seem like you're going to be immediately on welfare, let you in for 7-year probation. Yes, there would be a second-tier status for those 7 years, after which you can become a citizen if things are good. To me, it seems like second-tier status sounds odious, but it's better than where you came from. Yeah. Is that workable?
It's so it does have an appeal. I would worry that the arguments against are going to go like this: that they're going to come, they're going to put down roots, and they're going to intermarry, or they're going to have, they're going to embed themselves in society. So it's a lot like temporary protection. So do you know about TPS?
No.
Okay, TPS, another product of the 1990 Immigration Act, is called temporary protection. And so the idea is that if there's an earthquake in Guatemala or an earthquake in Haiti, and you're in the country on a visitor visa or you're undocumented, we will not send you back to a devastated country. We'll give you temporary protection. And it's like for a year, 18 months, and it's at the discretion of the Attorney General. But Salvadorans have been here for decades on temporary protection because they've got now asylum claims, and the asylum claims are all backlogged. And literally for decades, people have been making these claims. So the counter argument to what you just proposed is, it goes something like this: there's nothing as permanent as a temporary resident. And I don't, I'm very sympathetic to allowing, for example, people who've fled totalitarianism, like in El Salvador, right-wing totalitarianism, right-wing death squads. I think those people have legitimate claims and should be treated very sympathetically. I'm also incredibly sympathetic to people fleeing gang warfare. I mean, those gangs have their roots in Los Angeles, a lot of them. And, that's an American export. People are very quick to forget that.
But you're saying people who fled their pursuers came with them over the border and established themselves in California?
I'm talking about like MS-13 in El Salvador. Yeah, that's an LA gang. And yeah, those were, it's a small number of people, but a lot of them got deported because they were gangbangers, and then they became very kind of powerful in especially El Salvador.
You mean they got deported from El Salvador?
No, they got deported from LA, from the States. Yeah.
Got it.
Complicated.
Well, this has been illuminating. This is good. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. All right.
All right. I wish you a good holiday, and maybe I'll catch up with you in the spring.
Okay. Okay. Take care. You too.
Take care. Take care.
Bye-bye.